I never thought putting up a fence would land me in a courtroom, but that's exactly where I found myself on a humid Tuesday morning in June, sweating through my only decent suit in a Jacksonville, Florida courthouse. My name is Frank Owens, and 6 months ago I bought what I thought was my dream property. A 3-acre lot in the Magnolia Estates subdivision, complete with a modest ranch house and enough land to finally have the privacy I'd craved after years of apartment living. The property sat at the edge of the development, backing up to some wooded conservation land, which was exactly what sold me on it. Peace and quiet, nature, and enough space that I wouldn't hear my neighbors arguing at 2 in the morning. The trouble started in March when I decided to put up a split rail fence along my back property line. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden fence to mark my boundaries and maybe keep the occasional deer from eating what was left of the sad excuse for a garden the previous owners had planted. I hired a local contractor, got my permits from the county, and figured that was that. I was wrong. 3 days into construction, I came home from my job at the logistics company downtown to find a woman standing in my driveway, arms crossed, face red as a tomato. She was maybe 55, with that particular haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," and oversized sunglasses perched on her head like a second set of eyes. "Are you Frank Owens?" she demanded before I even got my car door fully open. "That's me. Can I help you?" "I'm Patricia Henderson, president of the Magnolia Estates Homeowners Association Board. We need to talk about this fence you're installing without HOA approval." I felt my stomach drop. When I bought the house, I'd skimmed through the HOA documents. They were mostly about maintaining your lawn, not painting your house purple, the usual stuff. I'd paid my HOA fees on time, all $300 a year, which seemed reasonable enough. But fence approval? I didn't remember anything about that. "I got county permits," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "The contractor said that's all I needed." Patricia's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "County permits are one thing, Mr. Owens. HOA architectural approval is another. According to Section 7, Subsection 3 of our covenants and restrictions, any exterior structure, including fencing, requires written approval from the Architectural Review Committee, which you did not obtain." I didn't know I needed it. Nobody told me when I moved in. Ignorance of the rules doesn't exempt you from following them. She pulled a manila folder from her oversized purse and thrust it at me. "This is a cease and desist order. Stop construction immediately, or we'll be forced to take legal action." I took the folder, my hands shaking slightly with a mix of anger and confusion. "Look, Ms. Henderson, this seems like something we could work out. I'll submit the application now. The fence is already half done." "Should have thought of that before you started." Her smile was thin and cold. "The fence needs to come down, Mr. Owens. It's not just the approval issue. Several board members have concerns about the placement and style. Split rail fencing is considered rustic, and we have standards in Magnolia Estates." "Standards? Half the houses in this neighborhood have chain-link fences in their backyards. Those were grandfathered in before the current architectural guidelines were established in 2019. She turned to leave, then paused. "You have 72 hours to halt construction and submit a removal plan. Good day, Mr. Owens." I stood in my driveway for a full 10 minutes after she left, just staring at the folder. Inside was a formal letter on HOA letterhead, along with copies of covenant restrictions I definitely didn't remember from closing. When I finally went inside and dug out my own HOA documents, I found the section she'd mentioned. It was buried on page 47 of a 60-page document written in the kind of dense legal language designed to make your eyes glaze over. The next morning, I called my contractor and told him to stop work. Then I called a real estate attorney named David Martinez that a coworker had recommended. His secretary scheduled me for later that week. In the meantime, I did what any reasonable person would do. I submitted an architectural review application to the HOA, complete with photos, measurements, and a detailed description of the fence. I even included a survey of my property that I'd gotten at closing, showing exactly where my property lines were and where the fence was being installed. Everything was within my boundaries by a good 15 feet. 2 weeks later, I got their response. Denied. The reason given was vague. Something about incompatibility with neighborhood aesthetic standards and concerns about property line encroachment raised by adjacent property owners. The adjacent property to my fence line wasn't another house. It was the HOA's community clubhouse and pool area, which backed up to my land. When I met with David Martinez, he was sympathetic, but not encouraging. He was a thin man in his 40s with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many HOA disputes. These cases are tricky, he told me, leaning back in his office chair. Florida law generally favors HOAs. They have broad authority to enforce their covenants. The question is whether they're enforcing them reasonably and consistently. They mentioned property line concerns, I said, but I have a survey. The fence is completely on my property. Do you have a recent survey? One done specifically for this fence? I have the one from when I bought the house last year. It shows all the boundaries clearly. David nodded slowly. Here's what I recommend. Get a new survey done by a licensed surveyor specifically for this dispute. Make sure they mark all the boundary lines clearly. If the HOA is claiming property line issues, we need ironclad proof that you're in the right. It'll cost you maybe $1,000, but it's worth it. And if the survey confirms I'm on my property, then we have leverage to negotiate, or if they push it, we fight them in court. But I'll be honest with you, Frank, HOA litigation is expensive. We're talking $10,000, $20,000 potentially, sometimes more. You need to decide if this fence is worth that. I left his office feeling worse than when I'd arrived. $1,000 for a survey, potentially $20,000 for legal fees, all because I wanted a simple fence on my own property. It was insane. But I'm stubborn. My father used to say it was my worst quality and my best one, depending on the situation. I called a surveying company that afternoon. The surveyor, a weathered man named Tom Bailey, who'd been doing property surveys in Northeast Florida for 30 years, came out the following week. He spent an entire day walking my property with his equipment, checking old survey markers, taking measurements, and examining county records he'd brought with him. When he finished, he asked to sit down with me at my kitchen table. That's when I knew something was off. "Mr. Owens," he said, spreading out a large plot map he'd drawn up, "I need to show you something, and you're probably going to want to call your attorney." My heart started pounding. "What is it?" He pointed at the map, his finger tracing a line. "This is your property boundary, based on the original plat and confirmed by the survey markers I found. Now, you see this structure here?" He tapped a spot on the map where he'd drawn a rectangle. "That's the HOA clubhouse. Okay? According to my measurements in the county records, approximately 30% of that clubhouse is built on your property. It encroaches about 12 feet over your boundary line on the eastern side." I stared at the map, not quite processing what he was saying. "Wait, their clubhouse is on my land?" "Yes, sir. Has been since it was built, which according to county building permits was 2018, before you owned the property." "How's that possible? Wouldn't the previous owners have known?" Tom shrugged. "Maybe they knew and didn't care. Maybe they never had a proper survey done. Maybe the HOA just built it without checking boundaries carefully. It happens more than you'd think, especially in newer developments where things get rushed." I ran my hands through my hair, trying to think. So they're suing me about a fence that's completely on my property, while their building is actually on my land? That's about the size of it. And Mr. Owens? There's more. The pool area, the patio behind the clubhouse where they have those picnic tables, that's entirely on your property too. We're talking about maybe a quarter-acre total. I called David Martinez immediately. He told me to bring the survey to his office first thing the next morning. When I showed him Tom's findings, David's expression went from concerned to something I could only describe as predatory excitement. He studied the survey for a long time, cross-referencing it with county records he pulled up on his computer. "This is significant," he finally said. "This is very significant. The HOA has been operating a facility on your property without any legal right to do so. Technically, you could demand they remove it. Could I actually do that? Make them tear down their clubhouse?" "Potentially. More likely this becomes a negotiation point. They want your fence down. You want compensation for the years they've been using your land, or an easement agreement with payment terms. This changes everything, Frank. What do we do now? First, I'm going to send them a formal letter informing them of the survey findings and demanding they cease their cease and desist nonsense about your fence. Then, we're going to see how they respond." The letter went out that afternoon via certified mail. I spent the next 3 days barely able to concentrate at work, wondering what would happen. Patricia Henderson showed up at my door on a Saturday morning, and this time she wasn't alone. She'd brought 2 other board members with her, a balding man she introduced as Treasurer Robert Gaines and a younger woman named Linda Chen, who apparently served as the board secretary. "Mr. Owens," Patricia began, her voice strained, "we received your attorney's letter. This is clearly some kind of mistake. Our clubhouse has been there for years." "My surveyor doesn't think it's a mistake. He's licensed, he's been doing this for 3 decades, and his findings are based on county records and actual survey markers." "We'll get our own survey done," Robert said. He had the kind of voice that suggested he was used to being listened to. "This is absurd. We have permits for that clubhouse. The county approved it." "Getting county permits doesn't mean you built it on the right property," I pointed out. "And speaking of permits, I had county permits for my fence, but you all shut that down anyway." The 3 of them exchanged glances. Linda Chen, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "Maybe we can work something out. What if we gave you approval for your fence and we just forgot about the property line question?" "I don't think so," I said. "My attorney is looking into the property value I mowed for the years your clubhouse has been on my land, plus ongoing compensation if it stays there." Patricia's face went through several shades of red. "You can't be serious. That clubhouse serves the entire community, including you. I've never used it once, and the entire community didn't pay for the land it's sitting on. I did when I bought this property." "We'll sue you," Patricia threatened. "We'll bury you in legal fees." "You were already planning to sue me over a fence I had every right to build. Go ahead. My attorney is very interested in this case now." They left, and I knew I'd just made enemies, but I was past caring. The sheer hypocrisy of them threatening me over property line issues while their own building sat on my land was too much. The HOA's response came faster than I expected. 1 week later, I was served with a lawsuit. They weren't suing me over the fence anymore. Instead, they were suing for a declaratory judgment, asking the court to determine that they had a prescriptive easement over the portion of my property where the clubhouse sat. David explained it to me in his office, his face grim. "They're arguing that because the clubhouse has been there since 2018 and they've been openly using it all this time, they've gained the legal right to continue using that portion of your property." Can they do that? In Florida, prescriptive easements require 20 years of continuous open and hostile use. They've only got about 8 years. Legally, they don't have a strong case, but they're hoping a judge will be sympathetic to the fact that tearing down a community clubhouse would be expensive and disruptive. So what do? We file a counterclaim. We assert your property rights and demand they either remove the encroaching structure or compensate you fairly. And we push for your right to keep your fence up, since that's what started this whole mess. The legal proceedings dragged on through the summer. I had to hire David on a full retainer, which cost me $10,000 up front. The HOA, meanwhile, had apparently built up a legal fund over the years specifically for disputes like this. They brought in a law firm from Miami that specialized in HOA cases. Discovery was a nightmare. I had to provide documentation of everything related to my property, purchase, my fence, my finances. They were trying to paint me as a difficult homeowner who'd bought the property specifically to cause trouble, which was ridiculous. I'd had no idea about any of this when I purchased the house. But Discovery worked both ways. David subpoenaed the HOA's records related to the clubhouse construction. What we found was illuminating. In 2017, when the HOA was planning the clubhouse, they'd had a preliminary survey done. That survey had actually flagged a potential property line issue with my lot. But the board at the time, which had included Patricia Henderson, had decided to proceed anyway. There were emails discussing how the lot was owned by an elderly couple who probably wouldn't notice or care, and how it would be cheaper to build where they wanted rather than redesign the plans. In other words, they'd knowingly built on property that wasn't theirs, gambling that nobody would call them on it. David was thrilled. "This is negligence at minimum, possibly fraud. They knew they were encroaching and did it anyway. This destroys any claim they might have had to a prescriptive easement. You can't knowingly trespass and then claim you thought you had the right to be there." We filed an amended counterclaim, including the new evidence. I also began to understand just how much money was at stake. David had hired an appraiser who estimated that the HOA owed me at least $40,000 in back compensation for their unauthorized use of my land, plus ongoing payments if they wanted to keep the clubhouse there. The HOA tried to settle. Patricia Henderson called me directly, which my attorney said she shouldn't have done since we were both represented by lawyers. She offered to drop all actions against my fence and give me a $5,000 payment to sign an easement allowing the clubhouse to stay. I told her to go through my attorney and hung up. David negotiated harder. He demanded $50,000 plus an annual easement payment of $5,000 indexed to inflation. The HOA refused. They countered with $10,000 and no annual payment. We were at an impasse, so the case went to trial. The trial took place in late September, and the courtroom was packed. Apparently, half the neighborhood had gotten interested in the dispute. I recognized faces from the few HOA meetings I'd attended, neighbors I'd waved to in passing. Most of them looked at me like I was the villain in this story, which stung more than I wanted to admit. The HOA's attorney, a sharp woman named Michelle Crawford, argued that my survey was flawed, that the property lines had been unclear for years, and that the community would suffer irreparable harm if they had to remove or relocate the clubhouse. She brought in their own surveyor, who quibbled with some of Tom Bailey's methodology, though he couldn't dispute the basic findings. She also argued that I was being unreasonable, that I'd only owned the property for a year and was suddenly demanding tens of thousands of dollars over a technicality. She painted me as a greedy opportunist who cared more about money than community. David's approach was different. He stuck to the facts. Property rights, black letter law, the HOA's own documents showing they'd known about the encroachment. He argued that the HOA had repeatedly changed their story, first claiming my fence was the problem, then pivoting to claiming they had rights to my land when their own encroachment was discovered. Dianaso. This isn't about community, David told the judge, a stern older man named Harold Mitchell. This is about an HOA board that made a mistake, got caught, and now wants the homeowner to pay for their error. Mr. Owens has been nothing but reasonable. He built a fence on his own property with proper permits. The HOA came after him, and when he proved he was in the right, they still refused to back down. I had to testify, which was terrifying. Michelle Crawford tried to make me look bad, asking why I needed such a large fence, whether I had problems with my neighbors, if I was generally a difficult person. I kept my answers short and honest. I wanted privacy. I got along fine with everyone except the HOA board. I'd followed all the rules I knew about. Patricia Henderson testified too. Under oath, she had to admit that the board had known about the potential property line issue before building. She tried to justify it, saying the previous owners had never complained, that the property had sat vacant for months before I purchased it, that they'd assumed everything was fine. So you knew you might be building on someone else's property, but you did it anyway because you thought they wouldn't complain, David asked during cross-examination. We thought it was a minor boundary discrepancy at most, Patricia said, her voice tight. A minor discrepancy that turned out to be 12 feet and encompasses 30% of the structure. We relied on the information we had at the time. Did you inform the property owner at the time? Did you seek an easement agreement or any legal right to use their land? No, but no further questions. The trial lasted 3 days. By the end, I was exhausted and emotionally drained. Judge Mitchell said he'd review all the evidence and issue a ruling within 30 days. Those 30 days were some of the worst of my life. I couldn't sleep well. Work was a struggle. Every time I saw a neighbor, I felt their judgment. Someone spray-painted greedy on my mailbox one night, and I had to file a police report. The HOA board sent out a newsletter to the community explaining their side of the dispute, which made me sound like a monster. I thought about giving up, just settling for whatever they'd offer, and moving on with my life. But every time I drove past that clubhouse, sitting on my property without permission, something hard and stubborn in my chest said, no. This was the principle of the thing. The ruling came down on October 15th. Judge Mitchell found in my favor on every significant point. He ruled that my survey was accurate and that the HOA's clubhouse was indeed encroaching on my property. He rejected their claim of prescriptive easement, citing the fact that they'd knowingly built on disputed land and that insufficient time had passed regardless. He ordered the HOA to either remove the encroaching portion of the structure within 6 months or negotiate an easement agreement with me. He also ruled that they had to compensate me for past unauthorized use of my land. He set the amount at $35,000, slightly less than we'd asked for, but still substantial. And he threw out all their complaints about my fence, ordering them to approve my architectural application immediately and awarding me legal fees of $12,000. I sat in the courtroom as the judge read his decision, and I felt something between relief and disbelief wash over me. David shook my hand, a rare smile on his face. Behind me, I could hear Patricia Henderson's sharp intake of breath. But if I thought that was the end of it, I was wrong. The HOA appealed the decision, which meant more legal limbo. But they also had to deal with an angry membership. Once the ruling went public and neighbors actually read what had happened, how the board had knowingly built on private property and then tried to bully me when I discovered it, opinion began to shift. I started receiving apologetic emails from neighbors. Someone left a fruit basket on my porch with a note that just said, "Sorry." At the next HOA meeting, which I attended with David's blessing, there was a motion to recall the entire board. Patricia Henderson fought it, of course. She stood up at that meeting, her face flushed, and tried to defend the board's actions. She said they'd been protecting property values, maintaining community standards, doing what was best for everyone. A man named George, who lived 3 houses down from me, stood up and cut her off. "You cost this HOA $35,000 plus legal fees because you were too proud to admit you made a mistake. You tried to bully Frank into giving up his property rights. That's not leadership. That's tyranny." The recall vote passed with 80% in favor. Patricia Henderson, Robert Gaines, and Linda Chen were removed from the board effective immediately. A new board was elected on the spot, including George and 2 other neighbors who'd been vocal about wanting change. The new board dropped the appeal within a week. They approached me through their new attorney and asked if we could negotiate a reasonable easement agreement. We settled on $40,000 as a lump sum payment for past use and to purchase a permanent easement for the clubhouse and pool area. They also agreed to pay for a new survey to establish exactly where my property ended and the easement began, and to install proper markers. My fence, of course, was fully approved. The check arrived in early November, $40,000 plus the $12,000 in legal fees I was awarded. After paying David his bills, I was still up about $25,000. Not a fortune, but enough to feel like justice had been served. The fence was completed by Thanksgiving. Standing in my backyard, looking at the simple split-rail fence marking my property, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the money. It was about standing up for myself when powerful people tried to push me around. It was about not backing down when the easier path would have been to just give in. Patricia Henderson moved out of the neighborhood in December. I heard through the grapevine that she'd taken a job in another state. I didn't feel particularly triumphant about that. Mostly I felt tired. But the story doesn't quite end there. In January, the new HOA board approached me with a proposal. They wanted to host a community barbecue at the clubhouse, partly to celebrate new leadership and partly as a sort of peace offering to me. They asked if I'd be willing to attend as a guest of honor. I almost said no. After everything that had happened, the idea of being the center of attention at an HOA event sounded awful. But George, who'd become something of a friend through all this, convinced me it would be good for the community to move forward. The barbecue was on a sunny Saturday in late January. I showed up expecting awkwardness and got exactly that, at least at first. People didn't quite know how to act around me. But after the new board president, a friendly woman named Carol Wilson, gave a short speech about learning from mistakes and respecting property rights, things loosened up. People came up to me throughout the afternoon. Some apologized for assuming I was in the wrong. Others thanked me for exposing the previous board's overreach. A few admitted they'd had their own run-ins with Patricia Henderson over minor rule violations and felt vindicated by what had happened. I talked to a young couple who were planning to build a deck and were nervous about getting HOA approval. I walked them through the proper process and assured them the new board seemed reasonable. I chatted with an elderly woman who told me stories about the neighborhood before the HOA got aggressive with enforcement. I even played a round of cornhole with some kids who didn't care about property disputes and just wanted someone to toss beanbags with them. As the sun started to set and people began to drift home, I found myself sitting on a picnic table, eating a burger, looking around at the clubhouse and pool area that technically sat on my land but served everyone. George sat down next to me with a beer. "You know," he said, "when this all started, I thought you were crazy to fight them. Seemed easier to just take down the fence and move on." "I thought about it," I admitted. "A lot. I'm glad you didn't. We needed someone to stand up to that board. They'd gotten out of control, making people's lives miserable over paint colors and mailbox styles. You did everyone a favor." "I just wanted to build a fence," George laughed. "That's what makes it perfect. You weren't looking for a fight. You were just trying to live your life on your own property. That's all any of us want." We sat there for a while in comfortable silence, watching the last of the sunlight filter through the trees beyond my fence line. The trees I'd bought the property to be near, the privacy I'd wanted, the peace I'd fought for. The legal battle had lasted 9 months from start to finish. 9 months of stress, anger, sleepless nights, and constant second-guessing. But sitting there, on that January evening, I knew I'd made the right choice. Not because I'd won money or proven a point, but because I'd refused to let someone take something that was mine just because they thought they could. My fence still stands today, marking the boundary of my property. It's weathered now, the wood aged to a soft gray. On the other side, the clubhouse hosts neighborhood events, kids' birthday parties, and summer pool days. The easement agreement hangs in a frame in my home office, next to the survey that started everything. Sometimes I'll be out in my yard and hear laughter from the pool area. Families enjoying their summer, kids splashing in the water, the smell of someone grilling burgers drifting over my fence. And I don't begrudge them that space. The HOA pays me fairly for it now, and it serves its purpose. But every time I walk my property line, checking on my fence, or just enjoying the evening air, I remember what it took to establish that boundary. The surveyor's discovery, the legal battle, the community turning against me and then turning around again. I remember Patricia Henderson's face when the judge read his ruling and the weight of that first HOA cease and desist letter in my hands. The new board is better. They enforce rules reasonably, they communicate clearly, and they respect property rights. Carol Wilson runs meetings efficiently and without the petty power plays that characterized Patricia's tenure. When there's a dispute, they look for compromise before threatening legal action. Last month, I was even elected to the Architectural Review Committee. The irony isn't lost on me. I review fence applications now, among other things, and I make sure every homeowner knows their rights, understands the process, and gets treated fairly. I remember what it felt like to be on the other side. My contractor, the one who had to stop work on my fence that first time, called me a few months ago. He'd been hired by another homeowner in a different subdivision, and they were having HOA trouble. He asked if he could give them David Martinez's contact information. I said absolutely, and I also spent an hour on the phone with the homeowner, sharing my story and my advice. Stand your ground when you're right. Document everything. Get proper surveys and legal counsel. Don't let anyone bully you out of your property rights, no matter how official they sound or how many letters they send. But also pick your battles. Some things aren't worth fighting over. Some rules make sense. Community living requires compromise. The key is knowing when something is a reasonable request and when someone is overstepping their authority. My fence, it turned out, was worth fighting for. Not because it was the most beautiful fence or because I couldn't live without it, but because the principle mattered. Because saying no to unreasonable demands is sometimes necessary. Because property rights exist for a reason, and defending them defends everyone. I still live in that house in Magnolia Estates. I still pay my HOA fees, now $400 a year to help rebuild the legal fund they depleted. I attend community events occasionally. I wave to neighbors and help them carry in groceries when I see them struggling. I'm part of the community, despite everything that happened. But I also know my boundaries now, literally and figuratively. That fence marks more than just property lines. It marks a lesson learned about standing up for yourself, about not backing down when you're right, and about the importance of holding powerful people accountable when they abuse their authority. The whole experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I'm more confident now, more willing to question authority when something doesn't seem right. I'm more careful about reading contracts and understanding my rights before signing anything, and I'm more aware of how easily people in small positions of power can become tyrants if nobody challenges them. I think about the previous owners sometimes, the elderly couple who owned my property when the clubhouse was built. They probably never knew about the encroachment, or if they did, they didn't think it mattered. Maybe they liked having the clubhouse nearby and didn't care about the technicalities. But when they sold me the property, they sold me all the rights that came with it, including the right to that quarter-acre the HOA had been using. Property rights are strange that way. They persist even when ownership changes. They exist whether you exercise them or not. And sometimes, discovering you have a right you didn't know about can change everything. The surveyor's report still sits in my filing cabinet, along with all the legal documents from the case. I keep them not because I think I'll need them again, but as a reminder that truth matters, that facts matter, that documentation matters, that survey, that careful measurement of property lines and boundaries was the thing that turned a losing battle into a winning one. It's funny how life works sometimes. I moved to Magnolia Estates looking for peace and quiet, for a place to call my own, for some space to breathe after years of cramped apartment living. And I got all of that, but only after fighting for it. The peace I have now feels earned in a way it wouldn't have if everything had just been easy from the start. My backyard is my sanctuary now. I've planted a real garden, replacing the sad remnants left by the previous owners, tomatoes, peppers, some herbs. I sit out there in the evenings with a beer, watching the sunset beyond my fence, and I feel genuinely content. The sound of the conservation land behind me, birds and wind through trees, is exactly what I wanted when I bought this place. And when I hear noise from the clubhouse, laughter and music and the sounds of community, I don't resent it. The easement agreement means I profit a little from their use of my land, but more than that, it means we found a solution that worked for everyone. They get their community space. I get my privacy and my rights respected. It's not perfect, but it's fair. That's really what the whole fight was about in the end. Fairness. The idea that even a homeowners association, with all its rules and regulations and apparent authority, has to play by the rules too. They can't just take what they want because it's convenient. They can't bully homeowners into giving up their rights. They have to operate within the law, just like everyone else. The legal system worked, eventually. It took time and money and stress, but it worked. Judge Mitchell saw through the HOA's attempts to paint me as unreasonable and looked at the actual facts. The new board members had the integrity to drop a bad case and negotiate fairly. The community members had the wisdom to demand better leadership when the old board failed them. Democracy, even at the microscopic level of a homeowners association, can function when people care enough to make it work. I've become something of a local legend in HOA dispute circles, according to David Martinez. He's referred 3 other clients to me for advice, people fighting their own HOA battles over various issues. I talk to them, share my experience, and always end with the same advice. Get everything documented, know your rights, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. One of those people, a woman named Sarah fighting her HOA over a solar panel installation they were trying to block, actually won her case partly by using my case as precedent. Her HOA backed down when her attorney cited Judge Mitchell's ruling about HOAs overstepping their authority. That felt good, knowing my fight helped someone else. But I also warn people that HOA battles are exhausting and expensive, that if there's a reasonable compromise to be had, take it. That winning in court doesn't always feel like winning when you've spent months of your life stressed and anxious. That sometimes the victory isn't worth the cost. In my case, it was worth it. But that's a personal calculation everyone has to make for themselves. The fence itself, the physical object at the center of this whole saga, is just a fence. It's not particularly special. It does its job, marking boundaries and keeping the deer somewhat at bay, though they still jump it occasionally. I've thought about upgrading to something more substantial, maybe a privacy fence on at least part of the property line. But the split rail fence has sentimental value now. It represents something bigger than itself. This whole experience taught me something important about the American property ownership system. We have these strong protections for property rights enshrined in law and constitution because the founders understood how important it is for people to have spaces that are truly theirs. Spaces they control, where their word is law, where nobody can push them around without justification. But with the rise of HOAs, we've created these quasi-governmental entities that can restrict those rights significantly. And mostly, that's fine. People voluntarily join HOAs when they buy property. They agree to certain restrictions in exchange for community amenities and maintained property values. It's a trade-off. The problem comes when HOAs forget they're still bound by law, when board members start to think they have unlimited authority, when enforcement becomes personal or arbitrary. That's when homeowners need to push back, and that's when the legal system needs to step in. My case was a clear example of an HOA overstepping. They built on land they didn't own, then tried to intimidate me when I discovered it. But there are thousands of less clear-cut cases happening all over the country, disputes over paint colors and holiday decorations and parking spaces, little battles over authority and autonomy. I don't know what the solution is to HOA overreach. More oversight, better laws, more homeowner activism, probably some combination of all three. But I know that every person who stands up to unreasonable HOA demands, who documents the abuse and fights back when necessary, makes it a little better for everyone else. George and I have become good friends. We barbecue together sometimes, talk about sports and work and neighborhood gossip. He told me once that watching my case unfold inspired him to run for the board. He'd been a passive member of the community before, paying his fees and ignoring HOA politics. But seeing how bad leadership could make everyone's life worse motivated him to get involved. That might be the biggest lasting impact of my fence dispute. It woke up a sleepy community and reminded people that HOAs are only as good as the people running them, that board elections matter, that paying attention matters, that speaking up matters. The neighborhood is better now than it was before all this happened. The new board is responsive and reasonable. They've rolled back some of the more ridiculous rules Patricia's board had implemented. They've increased transparency, posting meeting minutes online and soliciting input before making major decisions. They've turned Magnolia Estates into what it should have been all along, a community that works for its members, not the other way around. And my fence stands as a reminder of what it took to get there. Every homeowner who drives past my property sees it, and most of them know the story. It's become part of neighborhood lore. The fence that took down a tyrannical HOA board, the survey that revealed a shocking encroachment, the homeowner who refused to back down. I don't love being a character in a story. I'm a private person by nature, which is why I wanted that fence in the first place. But if my experience helps other people stand up for their rights, I can live with a little notoriety. As I write this, it's been almost 2 years since I first started building that fence. 2 years since Patricia Henderson showed up in my driveway with her demands and her attitude. 2 years of legal battles, community drama, and personal growth I never asked for, but probably needed. My property is exactly what I wanted it to be now. Peaceful, private, mine in every legal and practical sense. I've added more landscaping, put in a fire pit, built a small workshop in the corner of my lot. I use every inch of my 3 acres, and I appreciate every inch knowing what it took to defend it. The clubhouse still stands on my land, serving the community under the terms of our easement agreement. Kids still splash in the pool on hot summer days. Families still gather for cookouts and birthday parties. The HOA still maintains it and pays me appropriately for the privilege. It's a good arrangement, one that benefits everyone. But it's an arrangement now, a legal contract between equal parties, not a situation where one side assumed they could do whatever they wanted. That distinction matters. I think the thing I'm most proud of isn't winning the case or getting the money or even keeping my fence. It's refusing to be intimidated. Patricia Henderson was good at intimidation. She had the authority of the HOA behind her, the weight of rules and regulations, the threat of expensive legal action. For most people, that would be enough to make them back down. But I called her bluff. I hired a surveyor and a lawyer. I fought back with facts and law. And when the truth came out, when it became clear that the HOA was in the wrong and not me. I didn't accept a quick settlement just to make it go away. I pushed for real accountability and fair compensation. That's not something I would have done before this experience. I was always more of a go-along-to-get-along person. Conflict made me uncomfortable. Authority figures made me nervous. I would have been the guy to take down his fence and apologize for the trouble. But something about the sheer injustice of the situation, the hypocrisy of them coming after me for building on my own property while their clubhouse sat on my land, brought out a stubborn streak I didn't know I had. And once I started fighting, once I committed to seeing it through, I discovered I was good at it. Not the legal stuff necessarily, but the endurance part, the refusing to give up part. My father would have been proud, I think. He passed away a few years before all this happened, but he always told me to stand up for myself, to not let people push me around. He fought his own battles with authority over the years. Some he won and some he lost, but he never backed down from something he believed in. I wish I could tell him about the fence, about the survey, about standing in that courtroom and hearing Judge Mitchell rule in my favor. He would have loved the irony of the HOA suing me over property lines while encroaching on my property themselves. He had a good sense of irony, but in a way, fighting this battle was carrying on what he taught me, about principles and property rights and not letting bureaucrats run your life, about documentation and preparation and playing by the rules while demanding others do the same, about knowing when to compromise and when to stand firm. The fence is his legacy as much as mine, in a weird way. I've thought about writing a detailed account of the whole experience, maybe posting it online to help other people going through HOA disputes. David thinks it's a good idea, says it could be valuable information for homeowners facing similar situations. But part of me wants to just let it be, to move on and enjoy my property without constantly reliving the fight. Maybe someday I'll write it all down properly. For now, I'm content to share my story with people who ask, to offer advice to those who need it, and to serve on the Architectural Review Committee, making sure no other homeowner in Magnolia Estates gets treated the way I was. The seasons have changed twice since this all began. I've watched winter turn to spring, spring to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter, and around again. I've seen my garden grow and flourish, seen my fence weather and settle into the landscape, seen the neighborhood transform under new leadership. Life has returned to normal, or maybe to a new normal that's better than what came before. I go to work, I come home, I enjoy my property, I wave to neighbors and attend the occasional community event. I pay my HOA fees without resentment, because the HOA is functioning properly now. And every time I walk my fence line, checking for damage or just enjoying the evening air, I remember what it took to establish that boundary. The phone calls and legal fees, the stress and the anger, the moment Tom Bailey showed me his survey and everything changed. It was worth it. Every dollar, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. Because this is mine now, in a way it wouldn't have been if I'd just backed down. I know every inch of my property. I know exactly where my rights begin and end. I know what I'm willing to fight for and what I'm willing to compromise on. And I know that HOAs, for all their apparent power, are still bound by the same laws as everyone else. That property rights matter. That truth wins out eventually if you're willing to fight for it. My fence stands as proof of that. A simple split-rail fence, weathered wood marking boundaries, standing watch over 3 acres of property that are legally, definitely, undeniably mine. It's not much to look at, but it means everything. And if another HOA board someday decides to overstep their authority, if another Patricia Henderson tries to bully a homeowner out of their rights, my case will be there in the legal record. A reminder that homeowners can fight back and win, that surveys don't lie, that justice, slow and expensive as it might be, is still possible. That's the real story of my fence, not just a property dispute, but a reminder of what it means to own something, to defend it, and to live with the consequences of standing your ground. The fence marks my boundary, but the fight defined who I am, and I'm okay with that.